Hello, welcome to the channel and thanks for watching. And in this video I'm going to talk you through 4 different ways that I fill gaps on warhammer models. I'm going to do it talking through the great and clean one you see in here, which you see there, quite a lot of gaps on the shoulders, quite a lot under the arms, and that's an inevitable part of building warhammer models or any sort of plastic model really from any manufacturer particularly. Also going to show you through this thermic plasma reactor, which is something I've got knocking around from an old Necromunda project I did. I used one of them on some scenery and is the one I still got knocking about. So I'm going to show you through 4 techniques for filling gaps on models, 2 of which only work on plastic models, the other 2 work on plastic and resin models. And these 4 techniques, firstly, is going to be glue. Now I know that sounds fairly obvious, but there is a way of using glue pots, especially with the brush like we've got in here, to fix sort of smaller gaps. Then we're going to move on and talk about this stuff, which is sprue goo. Now this is little bits of plastic melted in poly cement. So this is an old Tamiya pot of poly cement that I kind of half used, and you put little bits of sprue in small pieces into that mixture, let it melt. I'm sure you're using it later. Milliput, you see me using that a lot on the channel. I'll show you how to fill gaps with it. And Citadel liquid green stuff. Now there are lots of other items available on the market for filling in gaps, but these are the 4 that I use the most. Look, drop a comment down below if you've got something you use which is better. Now the first method of filling gaps is the more glue method. Now with small gaps on models, which the gaps on the front of this reactor are relatively small, how the polycement works is by literally melting the 2 sides of the plastic, and that seals the model together. Now small gaps that are left, you can put some more polycement on, like I'm doing here, but you do need to do it with a brush. If this was like a squirt on one, you would end up with lumps and bumps, and you are literally just smoothing that polycement across both sides of the gaps so that it bonds together, it melts either side. Now you've got to be careful, because if you start putting too much glue on or you don't smooth it across, you can end up with rough patches. But if you see like I'm using here, basically you are almost painting this model and you're trying to make it as smooth as possible as you're going. And really, that's it. That is a technique. So not really a technique as such, but just stick some more glue on and you'll see there it's starting to melt those 2 sides together and closing up smaller gaps. You'll also notice at the bottom of that reactor though, the gaps are slightly too large for actually enough of that plastic to melt to seal them together. And this is where we bring in the sprue goo. So again, like I said before, this is small pieces of sprue that you chop off the model, or when you refinish the model, drop it into some poly cement, let it dissolve. Use it like here. There are other ways of making sprue goo. This is what we're talking about at the moment. So I'm using a cocktail stick to take a small amount out of that pot, using the other end of the cocktail stick to kind of squodge it around, very technical term there, until it fills the gaps. Now this method can be very, very messy, and if you're not confident, you can end up wrecking the model. So just to warn you on that one, you can end up leaving lumps and bumps and things, but you can file it off later. So again, once you've got enough on there, take that same brush that you had before for your poly cement, and again, smooth it around the model. So put some poly cement on, and you're literally making this sprue goo slightly runnier, so it'll flow into the cracks, and you can also smooth it out across the model. We'll see it again later on, and we'll do a great unclean one on with it as well. Now, method number 3. The first 2 methods you've seen there will only really work on plastic models, because obviously it relies on melting the 2 halves of the plastic model together and filling the gaps with essentially melted parts of the own model. This method will work on plastic, resin, metal, everything. So this is Milliput, it's a 2-part kind of epoxy putty. Mix the 2 parts together like we see in here, and then we'll show you how to use it. Now you can also use green stuff for this method. I personally find that Milliput works slightly a little bit better. It's also a lot cheaper than green stuff, and I find that when you mix water with it, it can it breaks up a little bit more, and it's easier to push into the smaller gaps. And that is literally all we're doing. We're taking that Milliput, making a tiny little sausage, and we're laying it across that rather large gap in the shoulder of the great unclean one. And then I'm taking a silicone sculpting tool. This is a green stuff oil one, but really any kind of silicone ended tool. You could use an old paintbrush, use whatever, and you're literally pushing it into those gaps and smoothing it along. And when I'm doing it, you'll see me go off screen, and I'm just putting the end of this into water, so it makes the Milliput kind of liquidy and runny a little bit. So another technique people will mention, you can mix a little bit of isopropyl alcohol in with this Milliput, and it makes it more of a paste. Sort of liquidizes it a little bit more. Now I don't tend to do that, because liquid green stuff we're going to talk about in a minute does that as well, and I like these techniques to be as quick and as sort of mess free as possible, and I found I haven't needed to do the isopropyl part, but it almost makes the Milliput a little bit like a sprue goo, so it's a little bit more liquid and runny. I find it easier to use Milliput like this, and I do use all these techniques on the same model sometimes. So I find the glue and the sprue goo technique is kind of sort of useful. It's there. The pots are always on the side of the desk, so it's quite easy to get to. The Milliput is better for bigger gaps, and again, quite often in my projects you'll know that I do a lot of conversion, so you've got some Milliput mixed. It's fairly easy to dig it out. Now here's something I don't use as often anymore. When I first started filling gaps, I went through a lot of liquid green stuff. You will see I've used it in quite a lot of projects for other purposes, and I tend to find this is not quite as good as doing either the poly cement and sprue glue technique, or just using the Milliput technique. It's still absolutely fine, and if this is what you've got access to and this is what you're comfortable doing, it's fine. There is less risk of going wrong with this technique, and all we're doing is taking a brush that, you know, is a good solid like vinyl brush. You do not want to use your Kolinsky sable brushes for this. Use an old brush or one you know you can clean quite easily, and you take small amounts of this liquid green stuff and you paint it into the gaps. Now don't worry with this technique if you get it over the kind of rest of the model a little bit, because you can file it off later, and I do find you do need to with this technique. The other one's a little bit less so. So I'm going to show you again, using the sort of techniques we've already covered onto the arm of the Great Unclean One, a rather vicious gap here. Now the pitfalls, I want to talk about it again, of using the sprue glue is this. I have now lumped that on, and there's quite a big blob on that arm. Now if I was to walk away and leave that now, we would effectively ruin this arm and end up with that giant sort of raised area. You see here I'm taking the end of the cocktail stick like I did before, kind of slightly got off camera, and kind of picking some of it off and smoothing it around. Now if you were to, again, to walk away, put too much stuff on, panic a little bit at this stage, you could potentially wreck the model. And then we're going back with the brush and, again, a little bit of poly cement, smoothing it down into the cracks. Now, I would say the harder of the techniques to get right is this sprue glue version. I find it can give a better finished effect, but you do have to be super careful, because you can, you know, if you, for obvious reasons, if you were to not get this part right with the brush, you could end up ruining tons of detail on a model. Now I'm fairly confident with it. I've been doing this for literal years. This is a technique that I got shown by my dad when I was about 8 years old. Made a first model in the 1980s. So I've been doing this for years and years and years. I feel quite comfortable with it. However, sometimes, you know, if you've got lots of small detail on a model, you can take some of that off, because effectively you are putting a lot of glue over the top and melting that down again. Now on Nurgle, like I'm doing here, even if I was to mess it up a little bit, it doesn't matter, because the skin would then be a little bit lumpy bumpy, it would look nurgly. If you were doing that technique on a Land Raider or a tank that you wanted to keep pristine, you might want to just go to the Milliput version. So now I'm showing you some smaller details about how to do this Milliput technique, and you can see taking tiny little blobs of the Milliput and just running it over the surface and pushing it into these small gaps, and you can push it away from the small gaps and keep playing with it until it all drops in to either tiny gaps or surface undulations, whatever it is you want to do. So really this is the easier technique because you've got more time to actually do it, and sometimes, you know, rushing yourself can prevent problems. So the other thing to talk about is really, do I do this on every single model? No, categorically not. If you watch my channel, you will see the occasional model with some mould lines and gaps and things that I haven't fixed. And look, that's fine, because they're not presentation models, they're gaming models. However, I do go around and fix the bigger, more obvious gaps that will really stand out in the paint scheme. On this final model, I'm not going to fix some of the gaps that are underneath the arms that you're never going to see when you're playing it. However, I do like to fix the very visible, obvious ones. Now with the green stuff technique, the liquid green stuff, see here I'm going back over and putting a second layer on because I wasn't quite happy with how it goes. And I suppose the thing about the liquid green stuff, probably very easy to get hold of, very easy to kind of use, you know, not too much risk of it messing up. You're not getting your hands covered in Milliput, that kind of stuff. So I suppose easier technique, but you will have to do the little bit you see in here. So when it's thoroughly dried, I'm just filing off the edges of that liquid green stuff, because it's gone a little bit raised over the skin. And again, nothing wrong with doing that on the other piece we've done. You might want to go back over with a file if you've left ridges and stuff. I do find with the Milliput technique, very, very rarely have to do any correction work, but do sometimes have to do correction work on the sprue glue technique, because you may have put a little bit too much on, but then you are treating it exactly like plastic. So I hope that kind of makes sense. That's kind of 4 different ways of fixing gaps on Warhammer models. Like I said before, do I do it on everyone? No, you can see a couple of gaps and cracks here underneath that I'm probably not going to fix, but it is useful to be able to fix that on the very visible areas, because we spend a lot of time on these models. You know, a little bit of extra time fixing gaps can always be kind of useful. So just to show you some final effects as I'm just filing down some little bits on these plasma generators. Yeah, so really sort of this is kind of what I put in my toolbox. I've got all these little bits of equipment sat at the side. Sometimes use them, sometimes don't. Sometimes use one technique and they're no real better than each other. It's just getting used to them yourself. And the final shot of the finished effect. See you later.